All right. I've whacked it onto lecture mode, which kind of emphasises even more the fact that I'm wearing this wristband, which kind of makes me look like I'm out on day release. I promise that's not the case. But it does emphasise the role of technology, I guess, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So this thing, believe it or not, is tracking my location as I move around this area, as the video cameras are able to sort of follow me around the room. I'll also respond to Jim's comment before. He mentioned the fact that he was feeling pretty good this morning because the West Coast Eagles had a win last night. I'm an Essendon supporter, but I am not going to let... We're gonna go with lights?
Actually film you.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I'm an Essendon supporter, but I'm not going to let that dampen my spirit, and I'm going to remain as passionate as I possibly can be about my topic, which is about integrating primary mathematics the best possible way that we can. If my clicker works. Okay, there we go. So a couple of other things. I wanted to... Kate spoke to you this morning about using Twitter, and actually our Dean referenced Linda Darling-Hammond. She has lots of different things that she says lots of really good things about. Yesterday she tweeted this: "The fear of new technologies is as old as Socrates, who railed against books. It continues in heated debates about the role of tech in the classroom. Our debates should get past if we need them and address how to use them well." And basically, that's what this session's about. Get over the idea that we're not going to be using technology. We need to be using it, and we need to be using it well. And we need to be able to learn new and innovative ways of incorporating it into our teaching. So I do encourage you throughout this session, but also throughout the remainder of the conference, to use that hashtag MAG/MEV 2019. Oh, did I get it wrong? Whoops. It's hashtag MAV/MEG 2019. I'm at DC Symons, so a bit of shameless sort of Twitter followers there. But also think about using Twitter as a source of professional learning. That quote in itself is worth considering. There's lots of really good stuff out there in Twitter, and it's a really nice source of professional learning. Okay, so an overview for this session. This session's actually based on a paper that I wrote with Associate Professor Raspberri Pis, who actually presented yesterday about data. And it was recently published in the Australian Primary Mathematics Classroom. There's a follow-up to that article coming in the next edition of that publication. And basically we were looking at 5 principles for the integration of technology in primary mathematics. So firstly, I'll go through a bit of a broad context. I'll talk to you about what the current state of technology integration within primary mathematics looks like. And then I'm going to take you through the principles that Robin and I sort of conceived of. I'm just going to quickly go through them. So the first one is access the affordances of Web 2.0. Certainly in this era of internet, it's absolutely everywhere. We can move well past Web 1.0, where it was just a one-way process, where we just consumed information that existed on the internet. It should be a collaborative process. We need to ensure an equitable approach in technology integration. We also need to invest in professional learning, not just techno-gadgets. So despite the fact that that particular principle only gets one slide's attention in my presentation, it's very important. We really do need to invest in our teachers. Our leaders need to be aware of this if we want our teachers to make really good use of technology when they're integrating it into their mathematics. And not just their mathematics. I personally, I'm a STEM person. I think within integrated STEM broadly. A big one is offsetting the procedural fluency with deeper conceptual driven learning. You'll see in a moment that the vast majority of ways that we utilise digital technologies at the moment in primary maths really does focus on procedural fluency at the expense of all of the other proficiencies. We need to move beyond that. And actually, that's even giving it more credit than it might deserve. Often, we're just using them as a babysitter. The last one is use interactive devices interactively. It sounds like an obvious statement, but that will make sense as we sort of move through. So I started thinking about the issue of technology in primary mathematics really a very long time ago. It was probably over 10 years ago when I was still in the classroom, when I was still teaching. And there were a few things that I noted. One thing that I noted was that at that time, and since then when I've been in classrooms observing, one particular pedagogical framework that teachers use in the maths classroom is the idea of a rotation. So within those rotations, you might have an explicit teacher group, and you can sort of see that demonstrated up here. You might have a workshop group 1 and 2. They might be over to either side of your classroom. You might also have a dice game group, and then also you'll have a computer group, which is this group over here. And the way that that would work is that they would rotate through each of those groups over the course of the week. My claim, my argument, and actually I've done some research to support this claim, is that that is not a very good pedagogical framework for primary mathematics. And the reason is because most of the time it's only 1/5 of the group that's actually getting challenged to move beyond their current level of understanding. So we need to think further about what the best way of approaching the framework of our mathematics classroom, but also more specifically what the role of integrating technology is. So often that does occur in the name of differentiation. So if you look deeply at those sorts of groups, you might find that workshop group this workshop worksheet group 1 is doing a different worksheet to the group who might be doing it tomorrow, and so there's a claimed differentiation there. But I'm not a big fan of that model. So as I said, generally technology or computers, in my view, were being used at best to drill mathematical fluency and at worst as a babysitter. So yesterday, or it might have been the day before, I Googled maths games. You can see it. It was, and this is the response I got. This was the first thing that came up when I Googled maths games. What I'm going to get you to do is have a look at the 2 maths games that came up as number 1 and number 2, and then I want you to have a discussion about the sorts of mathematics that can be taken from the games that I Googled. Before I do that, however, I'm going to just quickly take you through a little bit of data. This research was conducted by Lorraine Day back in 2013, and I think it still equally applies today. She showed that where technology integration happens in the primary classroom, the vast majority of it happens through the use of the internet. And when we talk about the use of the internet, she reported that the vast majority of the way that was used was through skill and drill Java-based applet games, the sort of things that I'm about to show you. We then had interactive whiteboards being used. As you'll see later on, the literature around the use of interactive whiteboards is questionable at best. We then had Mathletics, which is a commercial program that I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. Moving on, we had some more sort of active uses of technology. So spreadsheets were being used. Virtual manipulatives were being used. And the app associated with Maths 300 was being used. So if any of you are familiar with Maths 300, the app that comes along with Maths 300 really does support and enhance a lot of the investigations that you can find there. I would say that it really does need to be updated, but it can do things like allow us to create a number of samples within a dice roll game that wouldn't be practical in the classroom and things like that. So as I mentioned, I wanted to show you those games that I identified as being the number 1 and the number 2 games in Google when we Google maths games. So what I want you to focus on, what are these games doing for us? How are they helping us mathematically? It took me a while to work out how to play the game. You can kind of see that. I'm sort of, what's going on? Why am I collecting these coins? All right, I don't know how to select the number I want. So you can see you've got 8 multiplied by 5 up there. Still wondering what's going on. Okay, I'm determined. I'm going to work this out. Still not working. Oh, there we go. We've got it. Now, 5 by 3. We've got one option. Okay, we're going to collect this key. We're going to go through this magical portal. I've got lots of points. Oh, well, I guess there's some number happening there. All right, you get the idea. I think we'll move on to the second game. All right, and this one's my favourite because it's called Maths Invaders, and I reckon there's been that many different iterations of Maths Invaders that you know we've all been familiar with it at different times. Let's have a look at it. So I'm just shooting stuff randomly. Still going. It's all right, I came back to life. Still shooting. Doing pretty well here, I think. Oh, I get rewarded. Okay. All right, so we might stop that there. As I said, the two most highly ranked maths games on Google. Have a discussion now. What are the affordances of the game? How is it going to help develop students' learning? All right, can we have some responses from the audience, please? If you've got a loud voice, you probably don't need a microphone, like me. Yes?
We said that it was demonstrating learning, not teaching. Teaching the students anything.
Yep.
The student can demonstrate learning through it.
Yeah, what sort of learning?
That they know how to do 5 + 4 possibly.
Mm-hmm.
They know how to press or jump or whatever select button you use.
Yeah, I guess you could argue that there's a very small element of sort of problem solving going on there in terms of working out what to do in order to be able to move forward with the game. Yep. Any other comments? Yep.
Well, I was thinking that there's no mathematical thinking going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you could just pick anything randomly.
Yeah.
You have to really think about what you have to do to get the answer or problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's my concern. It's always been my concern associated with these sorts of Java-based applets that often do end up being the computer rotation that's within that rotation type situation. I would like to discuss this a lot more, but we do have lots to get through. So I just wanted to draw your attention to some quotes that I recorded when I was doing some research with some Year 5 students. And this is in relation to the way that they had been using technology in their primary mathematics classroom. So we don't really use we do, but we haven't really used computers for maths because we go to math group. We signed on math groups and we take our computers, but sometimes we don't really use it because we have the interactive whiteboard and all that. But last term we had this Math 300 and we were going to use it, but we still haven't used it. So yeah. All right, that's number one. And then we have this one. The multiplication games are more of like games, but they don't really teach you anything because all you do is just click, click, click. With the games, with the typing ones, and not really anything because you're just 7, enter. So it astonishes me a little that the kids are aware of the fact that they're not learning anything, and yet we still do it to them. But anyway, I remember last year, kids were just going, yes, We got computers in our maths groups because they thought of it really kind of like kind of an hour off, just like secretly just doing really nothing. This is certainly not what we want to see in terms of technology integration within our primary maths classroom. All right, some of my observations about most common mathematics games. They are often a lot of fun. So those two games that I showed you, after a while, I actually did quite enjoy them. I liked the sounds, I liked the rewards, I liked going through portals into Mysteryland and all of those sorts of things. They're very, very enticing, and there's a reason why they are the #1 and #2 games on Google, because kids like them. They're a lot of fun. Often they're purely focused on procedural fluency, if there's any mathematical focus at all. Mostly focused on multiplication facts. There's not usually an attempt to develop strategies. There's not usually an attempt to develop problem solving, understanding, or reasoning. And the reason I should have actually modified these slightly is because later on I'm going to show you a couple of games where some of these things actually do happen. They are often played successfully with no thought given to the mathematics, which was the point made down here. They do often include advertising as well when they're Java-based games. So it is worth noting that the kids are constantly being bombarded by advertisements as they're playing these sorts of games. They're often integrated into large commercial programs to support maths improvement. So also have a think about that. Have a think about the sorts of large commercial programs that your school is investing in, and then how the technology actually is supporting their mathematical development through that. This is all happening despite the Australian curriculum stating students develop ICT capability when they investigate, create and communicate mathematical ideas and concepts using fast, automated, interactive and multimodal technologies. They employ their ICT capability to perform calculations, draw graphs, collect, manage, analyse and interpret data, share and exchange information. So there's communication happening there via the use of their computers. And ideas, and investigate and model concepts and relationships. So there's a lot happening there. There's a real focus on students communicating their ideas, being able to represent and model their ideas within mathematics. There's lots of things that are happening there, but as it says on the whiteboard up there, saying it is one thing, doing it is another. So that brings me to my principles of technology integration. Do note that the order of these principles isn't significant in any way, other than it allowed me to begin with each of the vowel sounds, each of the vowels. So we've got A, E, I, O, U. None of them should really take precedence over the other, although I think they're all important. Okay, so we start with A, access the affordances of Web 2.0. So I'm going to introduce you to a small study that I did, and only going to take you through a very small section of it, just to talk to you about the possibility of using online collaborative mathematical problem solving as a way of embedding higher order thinking, problem solving, reasoning, critical thinking within your use of integrated technology in mathematics. So we had 54 grade 5 students, and they were placed in small groups within Edmodo, and they engaged in mathematical problem solving within an online space. The students were placed into groups of 3 to 5. I attended this particular school for a 9-week period, so basically for a term. And what I did there was I introduced a new problem each week, and we talked through it over the course of an hour. They were usually really rich, open-ended problems. Tried to make them as engaging as possible. You'll see an example of one in a second. Students then solved the problem online at home, and they did this asynchronously, so not in real time, via the medium of a message board. And you'll see which message board momentarily as well. Students were provided no classroom-based support in the final 2 weeks of this process, and that's because I wanted to see how the students' understanding of how the whole process worked without me giving them support. So there are lots of platforms that you can choose to use if you want to engage in online collaborative mathematical problem solving. You could use things like Google Classroom. You could use things like Padlet. You could use things like Moodle, SWOD, or Explain Everything to an extent. But whatever you choose, please be able to clearly justify your choices. So I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that slide. Hands up if you're familiar with that slide. Okay, so you're all the people that were here yesterday. This was Wei Tiong's slide talking about self-reflection. And it actually fits in really well to this presentation. So it's really about teachers going through a cycle of self-interrogation about why they're choosing to do what they're choosing to do. So in this case, a teacher has chosen to use Explain Everything, and then they go through this interrogative process to come to a point where they really firmly can see the purpose of using that application. And it might be different for different people, and that's fine, but they're able to justify their use of that particular app with a real clear evidence base that they have created. So here's my chosen platform, and I chose it with a really good purpose in mind. Firstly, I chose it because it was intuitive. It was really easy to use at the time. Can I just say, this happened a few years ago now. If this was me doing it now, I would not be using Edmodo, but this is the case as it is. It allowed for the creation of small groups within the larger group, because it was really important to me that I had small groups engaging in that online discussion to really be able to articulate their mathematical thinking, to be able to engage in mathematical argumentation and all of that sort of thing. It allowed for students to create artifacts to be able to be uploaded to support their thinking. So students created spreadsheets, they created graphical representations, they created Word documents, some of them even used Microsoft Paint to represent their mathematical thinking and to talk through their mathematical thinking. The other thing about it was that some of the students were somewhat familiar with the platform, as they had done a minimal amount of work with Edmodo in the previous year. So it wasn't giving them that huge load that it might otherwise have. So I'm not expecting you to read this. I'll just sort of skim through the details of the problem with you. So basically the problem was, it is sometimes said that each year a human life is the equivalent of 5 cat years. What does this mean? How old is your cat in human years? If you don't have one, pretend that you've got one. And then there's a whole bunch of other instructions given, to the students about the problem. We talk through that, but basically that is the nature of the question. They're then asked to go onto the online space, discuss it, and then create some sort of artefact that allows me and each other to understand their thinking around the problem. So here we have some of the online discourse that occurred with the students. First of all, we see the students trying to understand the problem. So we have Olivia saying, what does it mean by saying how old? Could someone please help me? It means what age is your cat? You get the idea. We then have some strategy formulation. What do you, I still kind of don't get it when it says by human years. Could anyone help me, please? What do you mean? You just go up by 1. I'm confused. So what we should do, in my opinion, is for cat, we could work it out with the strategies that Mr. Symons showed us, and like for camel as well. And then we should put all of them together. We then move down to a possible solution. So Xander just goes along on his own sort of track, just doing his own thing. I should point out, and it is important, and I've written about it in another paper, these two students were traditionally streamed into different... The standard classroom structure for this group of kids, this group of year 5 kids, was streamed. So there was a low ability group, a middle ability group, and an upper ability group. I mixed them all together. Xander was in the upper streamed group, and Olivia was in the lower streamed group. So I'm just pointing that out just so that you can kind of get a sense and a lens through the discussion that's happening. So Xander's just going off in his own tangent. I'm 20 years in camel years. Yeah, same. I'm going to do the section where we have to show how old family are if they're in lorikeets. Okay. So Olivia's still not really sure. I'm not really sure about that section, but soon I'll be doing the cat years, which is actually what we want her to do. And for the cat years, it goes by fives, yeah? So like 5, 10, 15, and so on. So Olivia has done a really nice job of creating a recursive expression that is going to allow her to solve the problem.
Was this typed or voiced?
That was all typed. I have to say, in this example of it, I've edited it to make it more to make it more intelligible. You'll see other if you look at my research. And you might not want to because it's quite dense sometimes. But if you look at my research, you'll see the actual verbatim sort of transcripts and things like that. Yeah, that's been very much neatened up. But the essence of the discussion is definitely there. So one way that they approached the solution was to create a pictograph with Excel. So basically looking at, these are humans, they're actually skeletons. These are lorikeets, these are camels, and I think these are dogs. And you can sort of see the relative human years versus cat years versus camel years versus lorikeet years. So that was one approach that they chose to take. They used Excel to produce this pictograph, which is pretty cool. And if you need instructions about how to go about that process, just Google it. You'll be able to find the instructions how to do it. And they also used, obviously, an Excel spreadsheet. This group in particular did something that I was quite impressed with. Well, actually, you can tell me what formula is that showing, which animal does that formula belong to? Camels, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so they've realised that if we take the number of camel years and we multiply it by 2, that will always give us the number of equivalent human camel years. So there we see a move from recursion to generalisation, which is what we want. It's a nice progression that's happening there. I had a nice box there animated. Oh well. Okay, and then we move on to ensure an equitable approach to technology integration. How are we going for time? Not that well. Really? Okay. Does anyone know who this guy is? Yep. Yeah, Sagartha Mitra. So that's Sagartha Mitra. He did a project in India, in some of the most impoverished sort of areas of India, where he basically installed computers in the wall to basically, as an experiment, to see what impact it would have. And simply by doing that, the children in the surrounding area, their learning and their development exploded. So really that's just a demonstration of why equity is so important when we're considering technology integration. We've got a quote here by Livingston. So she says, she expressed the concern that unless access to both computers and the internet, if required, are universal, a proportion of students, it says, may be unfairly disadvantaged, but I think that's pretty sort of tentative. I would say that they are disadvantaged. Students' access to computers, iPads, tablets, or other devices, if it's unequal, it's discriminatory. We need to make sure that that students do have equal access to technology. School leaders need to be aware of the access that the students have, and as necessary, supplement this by facilitating access to school computers or tablets before or after school. Why this matters for mathematics. So for a long time, we've looked at these different representations of, we've looked at these 3 different representations of mathematics and sort of thought, this is the approach that we take to teaching and learning of mathematics. We sort of move through the concrete, the abstract, the pictorial representations, all underpinned by language. So language is constantly being used to describe and understand the way that each of these 3 things are related to each other. My argument is that this should really be included. Okay, because it includes things like interactivity, dynamic representations. It also allows students to be really efficient with the way they work through mathematics problems. So if we're interested in equity with limited funding, what can we do? One solution is the Raspberry Pi. Hands up if you've come across the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so Raspberry Pi is a single board computer. It basically has everything that a normal computer has, but it's all been miniaturized and onto a single board. So instead of having a motherboard with a sound card and a graphics card and all these different things, it's all just miniaturized into one single board. It has a removable SD card instead of a big hard drive. The SD card has an operating system on it called Raspbian, which is a derivation of an operating system called Linux that some of you may be familiar with. And the ambition of the Raspberry Foundation, the vision, I guess you could say, Wee Tiong, of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, is a UK-based charity that works to put the power of computing and digital making into the hands of people all over the world. And we've got to move forward because I'm running out of time. Okay, all right. What do you need to run a Raspberry Pi? Basically, it says they're a USB mouse or a USB keyboard, but you can use a Bluetooth mouse/keyboard, which will mean that you only use one USB port on the Raspberry Pi. You need a TV or a monitor. You also need an HDMI cable, a micro USB power cable, which is the sort of cable that you get with like a Samsung phone. So they're pretty accessible. And you also need a micro SD card. This is what the Raspbian operating system looks like. It looks pretty familiar. It's a pretty familiar sort of operating system. It doesn't look that much different to something like Windows or the Mac operating system. Kids will immediately sort of feel fairly familiar with it. The Raspberry Pis aren't the only type of single board computers. There are others out there. This particular Raspberry Pi, I've added what's called a unicorn hat to it, and you'll see that working in a moment. This one, and this is a really important one, this is a Grove header. And why that's nice is because we can plug all of these different sensors into the Grove header, and that will then allow us to gather all kinds of data. So temperature data, humidity data, light data, and if you use your imagination a little, that has enormous affordances. I'm doing a project at the moment with a PhD student who's actually looking at how you can embed the engineering design process into the PYP curriculum. And one project that they're doing is they're creating a series of biodomes within their classroom, one to represent the desert environment, one to represent the tropical rainforest environment, etc., etc. And these sensors are being placed into the different biodomes to gather lots of different data about the environment that's contained within that little biodome. Think about the possibilities in terms of mathematics there. You can, okay, so we're going to gather data, we're going to analyse it, we're going to graphically represent it, we're going to draw conclusions from it. It is awesome. It is really, really good. And if you actually challenge yourself to sort of investigate some of this stuff, there are lots and lots of opportunities. That thing's called an NVIDIA Jetson Nano. I'll show you an affordance of that in a second. And that thing's called an Asus Tinkerboard. So here's just some applications of that unicorn hat because they look cool. I'll tell you a couple of things about the way the LEDs work. So basically every LED relies on RGB, and the way that coding works is that we get a value between 0 and 255 for R, for G, and for B, and we have different ratios of each of those values that give us our colours. Actually gives us about 17 million colours. But anyway, you don't need to really know all of that, but just check out what I can do. Okay, so that's one thing. So all of this is coded using Python, which is a coding language that a lot of primary kids are sort of becoming very comfortable with lately, and involves a lot of algorithmic thinking, a lot of other stuff. Okay, I told you about the Jetson Nano. This is called a JetBot, and it's an autonomous vehicle that's based on the Jetson Nano single board computer. It is possible to do these sorts of things with upper primary kids. The chassis for this has actually been 3D printed, so these sorts of things are also possible. Google AI Voice. You can also incorporate elements of artificial intelligence into single board computing and Raspberry Pis. So I bought this particular setup. It's based on a Raspberry Pi, and I'm just going to show you what the sort of thing that you can do with it.
Okay, Google, what's the weather like today?
Currently in Melbourne, it's 61 and cloudy. Today, it'll be cloudy with a forecast high of 73 and a low of 59.
Okay, Google, what's the weather like in Freehold, New Jersey?
I asked that because I was born
Right
there.
now in Freehold Township, it's 63 and clear. The forecast tonight is 53 and clear.
Okay, Google, what's the square root of 256?
Square root 256 is 16.
Okay, Google, what's the cubed root of 1024?
Cubed root 1024 is approximately 10.079.
This is my favourite.
Google, what's pi?
Here goes. Feel free to tell me to stop when you've had enough. 3.141592653589793322384627950288419716939937.
This relates to my infinity talk that I'm having with Derek later on.
Stop. Okay, Google, stop.
All right. So just a very quick comment on that. The reason I'm interested in this is because as you know, I'm really into STEM. So I'm actually in the process of wiring that up to my daughter's doll's house, where we're going to use the GPIO pins, that's the general purpose input-output pins, to be able to turn the lights on, to be able to do a Taylor Swift disco in the lounge room, to do all kinds of cool things. And I would not suggest for a moment that maybe you'd go to that extent with your students, but you could, I mean, it wouldn't be too hard to build a few boxes together to get some lights turning on and off using a single board computer, much like this. Okay, now the question is, why Raspberry Pi? The first one is equity. No big corporation is profiting, and they're pretty cheap. You can buy the latest version of a Raspberry Pi for about $70. So that's not too bad. Bare bones approach allows learners to actually see what the various components do within the system. And as we move forward, kids need to be getting better and better and developing their systems thinking. Easy connection of sensors, and I've spoken about that. Raspberry Pi uses a derivation of Linux, which means open source, and all the software it comes with is free too. So that includes Scratch, it includes Python editors, it also includes Minecraft, Sonic Pi, which is music coding software, LibreOffice, which is a free office suite, and more. So there's lots of good reasons to jump on Raspberry Pi. Just before I move on from Raspberry Pi, there are more user-friendly versions of it. So this is called a PiTop. And you can buy one of those from PiTop, and it comes with all of the bits and pieces. You put together basically a laptop founded on the Raspberry Pi platform. One really big thing about the Raspberry Pi that makes it a lot better than other things, 5 minutes, is that it has GPIO pins, which makes it possible to engage in physical coding. So that makes robotics, sensors and data loggers, artificial intelligence applications all possible. It's also more user-friendly, this version. All right. Okay, that's good, because invest in professional learning is just one slide. Professional learning, it's important. I'm sure I've probably scared a few of you with some of these different technological ideas. I promise you, if you engaged in some workshops and professional learning, all of this would become a lot more comfortable to you, and you would then think about the amazing affordances you could take in your classroom with it all. Moving on, offsetting procedural fluency with deeper conceptually driven learning. I'm not going to go through all of that because we don't really have time. Algorithmic thinking is a big part of technology. and it is a part of the Victorian mathematics curriculum, so it is something that we have to be familiar with. At its simplest level, algorithmic thinking can be seen as 2 + 2 = 4. It basically means taking a series of steps, adding them together to solve a problem. So as I said, at its simplest level, you can see it as 2 + 2 = 4. This is it at its most sophisticated level. I've got 10 minutes, don't I? Oh, question time. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's what I thought. Okay. Okay. So just thinking about algorithmic thinking, one really good way of approaching algorithmic thinking is through coding, and it's applicable from the early childhood years to the primary years. Tasks can be scaled up to be more focused on shape and location, more complex shapes, and we can also make really close links with digital technologies. But the basic principles to consistently developed are experimentation, verifying and debugging where necessary, recording and representing, comparing and discussing, evaluating and generalizing. So I'm just going to show you a few applications, a few approaches to developing algorithmic thinking, but also other areas of mathematics now. So where's Scott? Thank you, Scott. This is Scott's daughter, Grace. Grace is going to give us a demonstration of a B-bot. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. If we're thinking about EC, this is a really good starting point for developing algorithmic thinking and other areas of the mathematics curriculum.
So, Gracie, what are you going to do?
I'm going to press it going forwards and back.
Okay, and what are you going to do next?
Now I'm going to make it go straight and then turn right.
Okay, how would you do that?
So we turn through the straight button and then there's the right button.
The left button.
Now go.
I don't know if carpet's the best surface. Yeah.
Why did it do all those extra steps? What should you have pushed first?
The cross button.
Okay, you want to show me? Which button?
This one.
Now what would you like it to do?
Go turn left and then go backwards.
Okay, you show me how you do that. That's right, yep. And backwards. Very nice. What would you like it to do now?
I would like it to do
Okay.
zigzag.
I think we'll stop it there. So I was going to get you to have a chat about that. There's clearly a whole heap of early mathematics going on. The language that Grace was using was fantastic. She was using the language of location. The questioning that the actual teacher was using was really great too. And it's interesting because that teacher happens to be a secondary French teacher. So that was interesting. But certainly the basis of algorithmic thinking, that idea that we can put a series of steps together in order to solve a problem, was embedded within that process. So I'm attempting to take you on a sort of a developmental trajectory here. We're now going to move on to an example from scratch. I actually coded this scratch, and maybe you probably can't necessarily see what's happening, but I'll just talk you through it. Basically, what I've attempted to do is code the life cycle of a frog. So the first thing that we do, I had it connected to a microbit, which meant that I could press a button and that started off the process. Switched the costume of the sprite to an egg, put the pen down, waited 4 seconds, point in a 90-degree direction and move 300 steps. I then switched the costume to a tadpole, waited 4 seconds, turned 90 degrees, moved 200 steps. Switched costume to tadpole, pointed in a 90-degree direction, waited 4 seconds, had to turn 180 degrees this time, moved 300 steps, so back to here, switch costume, point in direction 90 degrees, wait 4 seconds, turn to 70 degrees, move 200 steps, switch costume to the frog. All right, so let's have a look at it. Okay, so I've got a couple of comments there. One is that I've deliberately integrated this process across the curriculum. There are science ideas being incorporated, but there are also mathematical ideas. Students would have to have an understanding of angle. They also are developing their understanding of algorithmic thinking. We are moving on. So moving from scratch, the next logical step is probably text-based coding. So I'm going to give you one example of that, and then we'll move on to our final comments. Hands up if any of you have played with or used Python in your classrooms. Okay, so this is definitely something that you'd probably do in year 5 or 6, and it's actually something that you would do as part of your work with Raspberry Pis and all of those sorts of things. This is a really simple bit of code. Basically, we import the turtle module. For those of you who are familiar with Logo and things like that, you would know that the turtle goes back to Logo, goes back to Seymour Papert, etc., etc. We define the turtle as Jim, so we've called the Jim the turtle. Jim equals turtle.turtle. Basically, for everything in the range, we're going to do it 6 times. And what we're going to do 6 times is we're going to move 100, but each time we move 100 spaces, we're going to turn left 60 degrees. So that gives us our hexagon that we have there. Now, what I want you to do is have a very, very quick chat, or actually maybe someone can put up their hand and tell me, how could I modify this code here to make a decagon? Yes? Yep.
Yep. So iron range 10.
Yep.
And then you can change the angle.
Yeah. So what would the angle be? 36. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Well done. Good job. Let's give a clap. And that is what you end up with. I also shortened the distance that the turtle was moving. I'm not going to go through all the rest of this because I've run out of time, basically. What I think I will do is just jump to our final val, which is use interactive devices interactively. So here's a display, a really fantastic display. I love this display. I was given permission to use this display, so just pointing that out. It was taken in the last few weeks in a school around Melbourne. Few things I love about it. They use tens frames. They've gone beyond the 100 days of school, which is fantastic. Really beautiful display. The only problem is this. What's the problem? It's on the interactive whiteboard. It actually took me to say that. Now, I don't actually blame the teacher at all for that. What I blame is the fact that there hasn't been the professional learning, the support to actually show the teacher all of the amazing pedagogical affordances of that device. So that's something to think about. Interactive whiteboards. Back in 2007, Zeffenbergen and Lerman raised questions about the use of interactive whiteboards. They basically said they were a waste of time back in 2007. But have things changed? In the over 10 years since their research findings were published, one might wonder if the novelty effect has worn off, and so maybe they're being used more meaningfully. But unfortunately, Sheffield 2015 still reports a reluctance of primary elementary school teachers to move beyond the unidirectional use of an IWB as purely a data projector. I know lots of you are using interactive TVs now. Same thing applies. It's still an issue. Little use is made of their interactivity, arguably the IWB's most potentially transformative quality. I think we're probably going to have to call it a day there. But I will leave you with some reflections. Cultural change is key. Move away from can't, move to can. When integrating digital technologies, think about how you will develop all 4 of the proficiencies. Do the students have opportunities for critical and higher order thinking? All decisions taken when integrating technologies in primary mathematics should be carefully examined. As I said, high quality professional learning is key to improvement in this area. And this one I really truly believe, and it's not just in technology, it's just something that should be in the back of your head at all times. A primary teacher or leader should be able to easily answer, citing a range of evidence, why they have chosen to utilise technology in the manner they have chosen. And yeah, if you want to know more about this, or if you want to pursue some of these ideas, contact me. There are my details.